Thank you for joining me today, and thank you graciously, Dr. Nav, for inviting me to the saxophone studio class online. It's really exciting to get to dive back into and reviewing my dissertation research that I did at Michigan State University. And the topic of today's session is Re-Imagining Fernande Decruck's Sonata for saxophone or viola and piano, subtitled Approaches to Registral Expansion in Saxophone Practice and Pedagogy. So I've broken this presentation up into two parts. The first part, I'll be talking about a new performance edition of Decruck's Sonata, which in essence is a glorified transcription of the viola parts. So people that aren't as clever like me, I guess, I don't know, that can avoid reading alto clef in the transposition, but then making a case for it as a pedagogical piece to study or restudy when working on Decruck's music. And the second half of this presentation hits the highlights of registral expansion of the saxophone with concepts that I draw from research in music theory and adapting existing saxophone methods. So without further ado, let's get started. So this new performance edition of the piece breaks down into a couple of sections, talking about Decruck's Sonata then and now, and talking about ways that we as a field have reimagined her work, and then presenting my version of the piece, which I don't want to claim as the definitive version, but I definitely want to address some of the decisions I made in making my edition of the piece. So getting to know Decruck herself, she was a brilliant all-around musician, having studied organ, gotten top of her class in her studies in harmony, fugue, and counterpoint. In her peak of her performing life, she also performed entirely improvised organ concerts, so she was quite the keyboardist. And in fact toured the US in her prime of her performing career. And of course, as we know her Sonata for alto saxophone, but in fact, she's written over 30 works for saxophone, which makes her a very important contributor to our repertoire and a champion of our instrument in many ways. Going back to her husband, who was actually a bassist and woodwind musician who played in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra under Arturo Toscanini. And together, they actually came up with a saxophone method book called the L'École Moderne du Saxophone. I unfortunately was not able to get access to this material, but knowing that she had this sort of lasting impact on the saxophone legacy is actually quite interesting. More information can be found on fernandedecruck.com. And I have to thank the curator of that website, Dr. Matthew Aubin, who was a great resource in putting this presentation and my dissertation together. So the piece was written in 1943. We all know that it was dedicated to Marcel Mule, who was the professor of saxophone at the Paris Conservatory from 1942 to 1968. And on the screen, you'll see on the left a score example provided by Dr. Aubin of the original manuscript. And on the right, we see the published edition that we see with Bilodeau today. The piece exists in its popular form, which is a sonata with solo instruments, which is alto saxophone or viola and piano, but there also exists a concerto form of the piece with an orchestral accompaniment. We can dive into that conversation a little bit later. So while Mule never performed the work in its entirety, its rediscovery of Decruck's Sonata has brought it to the forefront of saxophone concert and pedagogical canons. Jordan Kane has a really great dissertation called Rediscovering Fernande Decruck's Sonata, and in that document they explore the music history of significance of her piece and also a theoretical breakdown of that work. So I highly recommend that resource if you are looking to get that kind of background on her work. Other ways that this piece has entered the field is that it's become a very popular competition piece in many ways. In recent years, we've seen it in the Van Doren Emerging Artist Competition, the Female Saxophonist Competition, now known as the Elise Hall Competition for Emerging Saxophonists. And in fact, there's been a competition in her name, which has been postponed due to COVID, but more news will come, I am sure. And so while her piece has entered the pedagogical and performance mainstream, I much of the choice on which version of the piece to perform has been left up to the performer, been left up to the teacher. So that leaves us in a very interesting spot in how to interpret her piece. So that leads us to this interesting discussion of which came first, the chicken or the egg, or as we can transpose it to which came first, the saxophone or the viola. So in many cases, I think we can make a strong case that on the surface level, that the piece is a saxophone piece. I mean, of course, its title is a very good acknowledgement that it was a saxophone piece first, and its dedication to Marcel Mule seems like the obvious factor in talking about this piece. But if we sort of dig under the surface a little bit, we even in today's published version of the score, we see the viola as the listed solo instrument in the piano score. And we can see that going way back to her original manuscript. So even though the title page has Marcel Mule's name as the person that the piece is dedicated to, the viola is still listed as the first instrument on the piano score. And then when we look at the discrepancies between the viola and the alto saxophone part, we see major discrepancies in registers of the melodic material in the first two movements. And as we go through the piece, fewer and fewer discrepancies appear between the two parts, which makes us, which we can make a case that maybe she conceived the piece for viola first and then adapted it famously played without the use of the altissimo register. So I would say that I think it's important that we recognize the history of the viola version of the piece because she went to such an extent to make sure that the viola version was published. So I think she had a very strong imagination for the piece existing in those different registers. In the recording history of the piece, all the way back to 2012 with Claude DeLong's iconic recording, various artists have taken upon themselves to create different versions of the work, and different people will incorporate different elements from the viola score. And so each of these recordings is slightly different. And while, again, going back to the point that Decruck's Sonata has become a mainstream work of ours, there's no standardized hybrid version of the piece. A lot of the decisions that performers and teachers make on this piece are made on their own, which is totally fine. And then we can make a case for revisiting this piece because as saxophonists, we have discussed similar topics with other pieces. Claude Debussy's Rhapsody is a great example where we've seen multiple versions of that work published in different by different people. And even more relevant to the conversation, Florence Schmidt's Legende is another work for alto saxophone and viola in which the composer endorsed the alternate version as a viola or saxophone piece. And furthermore, the republication and re-release of pieces was a part of Decruck's compositional legacy. We look to her Chant lyrique, originally written in 1932 as a saxophone and piano piece, was reorchestrated a number of times for different instrumental mediums. In an interview I had with Dr. Aubin, he sort of said when she found a hit, she sort of ran with it to make sure that when she's found commercial success with a piece, that she would keep rewriting it to make sure that it stayed relevant in her repertoire, that it could see life beyond its original context if it found popularity in other mediums, which makes me believe that if she was alive today and saw the trajectory of the pedagogy of her field, that she would endorse this extension into the altissimo register as something that she would embrace because she was so adamant about publishing that viola score as well. So the purpose of the new performance edition, I wanted to make sure that we realized Decruck's original compositional ideas. Again, seeing her efforts in ensuring the viola part existed in the score makes me believe that she felt strongly about the registers in which all the melodic material existed. I also wanted to acknowledge the advancement of saxophone performance and pedagogy practices since Decruck and Mule's lifetimes. As we all know, the altissimo register is something that we readily embrace and teach. And then I also make a pedagogical case to recognize, reimagine, and revisit this work as a training piece. You know, we could make a case to acknowledge the original saxophone part to sort of learn the stylistic idioms that make Decruck's work so special, and then making a case to revisit the piece as perhaps a string transcription as we learn to adapt these principles of learning string transcriptions, like learning how to double tongue, dealing with the registral discrepancies, learning how to circular breathe, and using her piece as a vehicle for that learning opportunity. So ultimately, the new performance edition serves as a document to show what Decruck might have imagined for the saxophone if she wasn't constrained by the performance and pedagogy practices during her lifetime. So let's just dive into a couple examples. On the screen, you'll see on the left-hand side is the current published version by Edition Bilodeau. And on the right-hand side is my version. And the red boxes highlight the main differences in the part. So what we can see here is that right from the beginning, we see these octave displacements of her of the melodic material. And so if you play right from the beginning, we hear this melodic presentation right from the beginning. And in the viola version, we have a part, the second half of the motive is shifted up an octave. So right away, right from the beginning, the viola and saxophone parts diverge registrally. So that's just something to take into consideration, and we see that at the bottom of this first page as well. And then going into the second page, where we get into this infamous pentatonic running section, we see that the melodic contour of this original saxophone part sort of meanders a little bit more, whereas in rehearsal 3 in the viola part it sort of outlines a much smoother contour, which I think is more stylistically appropriate for impressionist piano music. Thinking about Decruck's background as a keyboardist, I imagine that these lines are a little bit more idiomatic to the style. And then going into this other transitional period at rehearsal 5, at the very bottom of the page, we see an opportunity to actually push the music down an octave to sort of explore the bottom range of the viola. So in the saxophone part, we can see over here where the saxophone sort of noodles in the mid to high range of the treble clef. In the viola version, we push down the octave, leading into measure 6. And then as we go in through the first movement, again, we see many more changes, extensions of music up into the altissimo register, and also an extension of that little flourish at the end of the cadenza, and one discrepancy between this rhythm that leads into the flourish, where the dotted 8th and 16th note are flipped in the cadenza between the viola and the saxophone part. In the second movement, we're starting to see the discrepancies lower in number. On the first page, we see the melodic material at the bottom of the first page. We can see that again in the saxophone part, it stays in the lower octave. In the viola part, it pushes up into an altissimo G, and that G is probably what pushed Decruck to move this music down an octave. And then the interesting part of the second movement is actually when the saxophonist starts arpeggiating through pentatonic patterns. She fills in some gaps and rests that are in the alto saxophone part, but these rests are then filled in the viola part because of, the rests are present in the saxophone part, presumably for breathing considerations. And leading into rehearsal 16, she fills in some of these pickup eighth note triplets, which are motivic material that are introduced on the previous page. And then, of course, on the very last note of the piece, which is omitted in the saxophone part, I'm reintroducing from the viola part. There's not very many, there are no register discrepancies in the third movement, and the only item that I noticed was a discrepancy in articulation in the final penultimate gesture of the piece, where in the saxophone part we hear an articulation between the two Fs, whereas in the viola part it's tied over. Something to note in the fourth movement is that the opening theme in the viola part is played as harmonics, and that's something I think we need to consider as saxophonists, so that we mimic that sort of glass sort of nocturne texture. So maybe considering playing without vibrato. Playing these notes as harmonics isn't super practical, because right when we get to the third measure, it just becomes very unstable and just not possible to perform as harmonics by measure 5. But at the same time, I think in acknowledging the viola part, we must inform our performance of this gesture as if we were playing this as harmonics. Over here, we see more extension of the music upwards into higher register. Nothing too crazy here, but again, thinking about if we were to revisit this piece as a string transcription, starting in rehearsal 40, we can sort of make a case for practicing our double tongue, right? If we're thinking of applying this lesson to the Franck Sonata, for example, the Decruck Sonata provides great training for that kind of articulation. Where the Decruck excerpt is a little bit more difficult is that it encompasses a much wider range for the double tongue, and in the Franck Sonata we deal with a much longer string of double tongue notes. Um, on this last page, we see this gesture at 47 pushed up the octave in the viola part, and in the saxophone part there's just a mistake, I think, in the saxophone part. So where this written G is happening on the last half of beat 2, it should be a written F. So for anybody that's keeping score at home, that's an important one to make sure to capture if you are playing from the saxophone part. So that reaches the end of my presentation of the new performance edition. I'm not trying to say that mine should be the version that people reference to, and in fact, there are tons of unofficial versions that are available for folks. And I mean, Dr. Nab has shared a couple with me that are very good. But I think the bigger lesson here is that as saxophonists that are revisiting this repertoire, we need to be informing our performance decisions by the advancements and advancements of topics that are relevant in our field to inform our interpretation of music from the past. Which makes me lead to this second portion of my discussion, which are approaches to registral expansion, to sort of give us tools to approach expanding the register of pieces like the Decruck. So throughout the saxophone's history, the instrument itself has seen technological advancements. For those saxophone nerds that want to keep track at home, these are sort of big dates to sort of keep track of, to see the technological advancements of like the addition of high F sharp and G keys on a soprano saxophone, extension down to a low A on a baritone. Um, so the instrument itself has seen expansion in its range. And then when we are teaching younger and younger students, they're dealing with altissimo much more than I think even I was dealing with. These are some excerpts of band excerpts that I've encountered over the years with extensive altissimo usage. The Concerto for Wind Ensemble features a first saxophone part that, if possible, he wants the saxophone playing up noodling around high Cs. In Joel Puckett's short stories, he actually has the soprano saxophone running up to altissimo Ds. He admits that maybe he was a little excited with that part, but when a lot of composers are conceiving saxophone parts these days, they are expecting some fluency with the altissimo register. So as teachers, I think it is our responsibility to prepare our students. Maybe these examples are a little bit extreme, but if you look at Roshan Edezadi's Anahita, in the third movement of that piece, the saxophone first alto cadenza begins on an altissimo G sharp. So it is not out of the question to expect these students to prepare for this register, because more and more composers are writing with the altissimo register in mind, even if they're not necessarily going to encounter the extreme examples of the Husa or the Puckett. And this is probably my favorite slide of the presentation. I think a lot of the conversations that we have about altissimo surround, or they sort of resemble the trading card market, right? Like everybody is going to saxophone conferences and sort of like figure out, oh, whose fingerings do you have? Who's using what? I'll trade you this fingering for your Bolcom thing if you give me this Decruck fingering or whatever. And so, and those conversations are great. They're fun. But I think they avoid the bigger issue at hand, is that there are a lot of pitfalls in the early saxophone pedagogy that prevent us from excelling and approaching the altissimo register more productively. For example, the saxophone was designed in a way for great accessibility. You don't have to have great technique to make the instrument function. So a lot of young students, they learn to correlate notes with buttons, and as a result you have a bunch of students that can play the right notes at the right time, but the conception of pitch, the concept of intonation, playing in tone with other sections is not as relevant because you just have to push a button and you get a sound that works close enough. If you ask a beginning French horn player, beginning flute player, beginning brass player, there's no way they'd be able to play a sound at the very beginning of their pedagogy if they didn't have all of these considerations in mind. Whereas saxophone, just press a button and for the most part it works. And as a result, these students, many young students, I put myself in this camp, our aural skills lack development, and by the time we have to encounter altissimo registers, we've not had enough practice of hearing a pitch ahead of time. Building intervallic content is not as ready, so that when we approach the altissimo register, we haven't had those conversations of playing in tune, playing with great tone, playing with great color, and then when students just press the buttons and something doesn't work, they are just not equipped to be able to work around those problems. So a lot has been written, about how to approach the altissimo register, how to develop these skills. And as saxophonists, a lot of us know these resources. But if you don't know them, the Top Tones for Saxophone by Sigurd Rascher is sort of the sort of pinnacle of overtone study. Eugene Rousseau's Saxophone High Tones talks about a number of modes on how to approach the altissimo register and has in-depth discussion about saxophone acoustics and using that to your advantage to approach the altissimo register. Donald Sinta's voicing is sort of the gold standard of how to understand how the oral cavity works in relation to into bridging the gap into the top register of the saxophone. And the recent republication of Rosemary Leung's beginning studies for the altissimo register by Gail Levinsky is a great resource because, we'll see that in just a second. So some of the highlights I wanted to bring to our attention is that while we see Rascher's document as an overtone study book, we often gloss over his concept of tone imagination. And again, he often talked about the conception of sound on the saxophone to be hand in hand with a conception of sound mentally, so that you always had to conceive the sound before you were to play it effectively. We'll touch on that in a little bit as we dive into some music theory research. And then again, revisiting Rosemary Leung's example, she uses popular tunes that look absolutely ridiculous. But the idea here is that you've heard all of these tunes before, and that you're using your ears to guide your approach to introducing new fingerings, new tones in the chromatic scale. So in this case, she uses the American national anthem to introduce high E flats in your technical vocabulary. So again, this idea that both Rascher and Leung are promoting are ear-derived competency with the altissimo register that I think we should dive into a little bit more. So in talking about this, why not address some of the research that's being done by music theorists that are talking about this concept in aural skills? So these are a number of documents that I find very relevant to this discussion. Timothy A. Smith talks about choosing a solmization system, whether you're using do bass major, la bass minor, doesn't matter. But the idea here is that we're training comprehensive musicianship skills in these classes, and that musicianship goes beyond pressing the right notes at the right time. Edward Klinowski talks about teaching pitch internalization, which is sort of connected to Rascher's concept of tone imagination, of being able to conceive pitch ahead of time to help with the technical development of students. And Stacey Davis's article on error detection, I think, is a relevant one to make sure that students, as they're approaching the altissimo register for the first time, are able to self-correct if they're able to make a mistake. So anyway, the topic I wanted to highlight was particularly the pitch internalization concept brought to us by Klinowski. He defines it by the ability to mentally create or recreate an auditory image without singing, playing, or otherwise outwardly producing the pitch. So the idea here is that you can mentally or hear in your ear intervals, pitch content ahead of time. You're setting yourself up much more readily to be able to perform at a higher and more consistent rate, which is, I think, what we're trying to do. Just because you have the right fingerings and can pinch hard enough on your embouchure to kind of hit a high G in the creston, that's not good enough. The standard of the field requires that the extension of the saxophone's range be something that's a musical extension of the instrument rather than a party trick. There are some perception studies that are quoted in this article, and by M.J. Farah and A.F. Smith, and it sort of affirms this idea that if you can hear it, you can play it, and it's even better if you can hear this ahead of time, so that when you approach the interval, approach the lick, approach the concept, that you're using your ear and your mind to sort of lead the way that you form your embouchure, control the airstream, so that your sound then matches what you're conceiving in your head. So in a talk that I like to give, I call it demystifying overtone practice, because I do think that as a prerequisite to altissimo study, students are told to practice overtones. And as a young student myself, I was told practice these overtone scales from the Rascher book, and I tried it until it worked. A lot of the times, I would sort of run my head against the wall and then it clicks, right? But while I do think that overtone study is one of the best tools that we have to teach students how to interface with the instrument effectively, I think there are several ways that we can streamline this process so it doesn't have to be quite a frustrating one. I certainly think there's no shortcuts to developing the musculature here, but I certainly think that we can make that practice much more efficient if we can use our ears to inform the way that we do this kind of practice. So mindful overtone work should develop aural skills concurrently with voicing concepts. So how do we do that? Infamously, in my teaching, I tell all of my students that 95% of their problems on the instrument are solved with air-related solutions, and aural skills is no exception. So with this acronym, I tell my students to attain the pitch, so be able to find an external sound source to get a reference pitch. Then I tell them, using Klanowski's definition, to internalize the pitch, so be able to create that auditory image in your head of what you want the pitch to sound like, where it needs to sit melodically or harmonically, and then realizing the pitch. And this can be done a number of ways, by encouraging students to sing the pitch so that we know that they can hear the pitch ahead of time, or of course by playing, and hopefully playing in tune and making sure that you're hitting the note exactly the way that you want it. So one way we can practice this through something like the Decruck, we revisit the second movement, where we have the melodic material at the bottom of that first page. So in the viola part, the whole thing is just pushed up an octave. So if we can get students to think about these basic intervallic relationships of octave displacement, we set them up to be able to approach that high G a little bit more effectively. So if we look specifically at the notes, or sorry, the musical context around that high G, we can see that we're just playing an E, we're extending this little E flat to G natural sort of contour. And if we think about it, that G actually needs to sit a little bit flat if we're to tune it justly and to play it in tune. Notoriously, acoustically, the G tends to be a little bit sharp on the instrument. So if we get students to internalize this major third interval, it allows them to then, if they can project this interval upwards, up an octave, to be able to hear that G exactly where it needs to be placed. And so that's an example of how the air concept can then be applied to music as you try to transition from the alto saxophone version part to the viola version in the Decruck, for example. Other ways that I found the air concept to be applicable to overtone work are in this example of an overtone extraction warm-up provided by Dr. Timothy McAllister from the University of Michigan. In this exercise, I think it's a great way to introduce the overblowing concept of an overtone without dealing with that first cumbersome low B flat. So in this exercise, the idea here is that you start with a low F, which is a very accessible note on the instrument, and then having students learn what it feels like to overblow that note. And again, thinking about this octave relationship, having them either sing the interval ahead of time, oh, somewhere over the rainbow, like that kind of association allows them to think about that interval more readily, so that they can play without the octave key. So by having them internalize the pitch content, interval content here. It sets them up, for example, sets them up for success to be able to navigate these overblowing concepts without worrying about getting a low B flat to sound, to shift between a bunch of like closed tube to short tube fingerings, or however you choose to finger that B flat. And then the next lesson in the next stage of the exercise is how to maintain that pitch across different harmonics. So in this way, you're using that internalized pitch to stay. Meanwhile, your fingers are changing, you're accessing different harmonics so that you're able to sustain pitch across different harmonics, which I think is a very relevant exercise to be able to do. And then being able to maneuver back down to that low B, fundamental B flat is another exercise, and being able to hear this relation of a perfect fifth in this case, expanded by an octave. So the whole exercise then uses the concepts of air, and only the basic interval content of an octave and a perfect fifth will teach a whole bunch about harmonics without, again, having to deal with the cumbersome issues of a low B flat. And this exercise then can get transposed up through the instrument. Another exercise that we can do is have students play overtones on the neck. And to save the discussion, on at least alto saxophone, the harmonics outlined on the neck sort of outline the boundaries of the altissimo register on the saxophone. So here, on the written pitch, we play a written F on the neck, and then it goes up to an altissimo G, which is again the breaking boundary between the F sharp and G into the altissimo register. And then up top, we can play a high E, which bridges the D sharp E break on the saxophone acoustic. If I was to play that on the saxophone, we'd see this line up. It's a little bit detuned, but we can see that the benefits of practicing these neck overtones allows us to access these altissimo registers by association. And then continuing an extension of Dr. McAllister's exercise, we move up chromatically through the shorter and shorter sections of the horn to deal with more overlapping overtones, but still using that air concept as the grounding point for developing the ear, developing oral cavity and voicing concepts. And then finally, if we extend and transpose these notes even higher, overblowing the palm keys of the saxophone gives us access to a linear fingering system that allows us to play up to A flat, double A flat. So if I demonstrate the exercise here. You know, that's not necessarily the most pleasant thing, but using this overblown concept, we give ourselves a foundation for fingerings that can give us a linear combination of fingerings that lead up to that double A flat. This is not necessarily a new idea. I think Sean Hurlbert does a very good job of describing this on his YouTube channel. So shout outs to Sean. So anyway, this idea of using this air concept then is not just for beginners, but I think for advanced saxophonists, overblowing these parts of the horn gives us access to a different vocabulary to more consistently access these higher partials on the saxophone. So in summary, I truly believe that true mastery and fluency must be based in fundamental musicianship skills, or else the altissimo register risks becoming a gimmick of uncontrolled squeaks rather than the necessary natural extension of the instrument's range and its artist's voice. So thank you so much for your time, and I am happy to answer any questions, concerns, or scathing rebuttals. Love to hear from y'all.
Hey, thank you, Jeffrey. That's I'm so glad you agreed to do this again, and you were able to present your info for us. I guess one of my questions is, you know, and we've chatted about this, you know, privately. When when choosing, to move into the viola range, um, it's interesting to me that there are some, when we talked about how some of the lines are, really kind of, the contour is awkward when it's in the original saxophone edition, right? But then there are some. There's that one that you mentioned in the very first, like the very first one in the first movement, where that's actually a really a very disjunct, like, going from the altissimo back down.
Yeah.
And so, did you have any thoughts about, like, okay, well, um, we move some things up, we leave some things, or did you decide to just like go straight to the viola as the original, um, and go from there?
Yeah, so that's a really great point. With my teachers and mentors that I studied this piece with, that was an ongoing discussion. Like, at what point do we make a case for it as a saxophone piece versus a viola piece? And I think that's something that we can talk about, the principles of transcription work in general. Is how much do we honor the viola part? How much do we adapt it for saxophone? That's a great conversation point. And for me, being the the hot shot that I aspire to be. I just wanted to take everything up the octave where I could,
Mhm.
just to give myself an understanding of what my options were if I wanted to come back to, okay, is this actually musically viable? Because I think the excerpt that you pointed out, I would say, is one of the fatal arguments against doing the viola version, because it's a peak that's in the first part of the piece that goes so high, and then you never sort of approach that register at all ever
Right.
again. So
Mhm.
you're sort of giving away you're giving your hand away too soon, kind of.
Right, right,
um,
right.
so for me, just not knowing that that option is there, is just informative, so that if I choose to do the viola version, this is just an option that I can choose to take or not. I'm just a little bit of a hothead that wants to know what toys I have to play with. So
Right. No, yeah, I get it. Thanks.
yeah. Um, Yeah, so yeah, I think, like what I said previously, there are so many different versions of this piece available, that I'm not trying to say that mine is the definitive version, or that if you use mine that like you should stay to it exactly. There are different cases to adopt the different transformations between the two versions, and that the arrangement of the viola part is something that, again, each person has chosen to adopt in their own way, as all the artists that we've heard recordings from have done it in their own way. So mine, I think, is just, at least has been a reference for me to know what options are available.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? They can be related to Decruck, Altissimo, or, you know, happy to talk about saxophone.
So, um, you were talking about the trading cards, with the fingerings.
Yeah.
I mean, let's trade some cards.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly. I have to thank, that slide was inspired by my dear friend Connor Mikula, who turned me to Magic the Gathering. But certainly in my own teaching of altissimo concepts, I often the discussion of fingerings usually comes very late in the discussion. Of course, you want to give students something that functions. You can't just say like, "All right, play 3 octave B flat major, figure it out, and hope for the best." Right? You want to give students something to grasp onto. But I think, there's this fine line, because I really think a lot of the discussions that we hear at a lot of these saxophone gatherings is like, well, what fingering are you using here? And I'm not convinced that all those discussions are based in a true understanding of. I'm not trying to call anybody out here. I'm certainly guilty of asking for fingerings, um, but an understanding of what tools that you have at this disposal, what tools you have at your disposal, um, and understanding why each of the fingerings is functional is, I think, way more important than the actual buttons that you're pressing down. Because one example I like to play for my students is that, like, you can play like an E flat major scale without actually fingering anything. Let me see if this read will work for me. Right, like I don't need my fingerings to be able to get the pitches to sound that high, because at a certain point everything is cross-related in a way that you can just voice everything into place as long as you have a good conception of where the pitch needs to be. So in my mind, ears and conception of the pitch first, fingerings come secondary. That being said, being able to ground your technique in something is, of course, makes the practicing of these things much easier. So there's a nice balance with these. And yes, I know that Dr. Nab had to leave very briefly, but did anybody have any questions about that? Right. Sorry, I see Kevin had a question. Do I have any personal insight when you feel using optional? Sure. And for me, thank you for that great question, Kevin. He asked, do you have any personal insight into what you feel using optional altissimo is appropriate and when it might actually detract from the work and phrasing? So one of the conversations that I had with Professor Luloff on this piece was making sure that the music came first, the technique was something secondary. So if there are certain pieces from the string repertoire that I think we all want to play, but because of certain idiomatic considerations, they're better left to the people that can actually play it without struggle busting through it. So first and foremost, I asked myself, is this musically relevant, and is it feasible for me to be able to do this consistently and convincingly? I think I was in a session with Dr. Shenquan Lin from the Eastman School, who was talking about, in our own private time, of course, we can play everything up the octave and just try to squeak in the privacy of our practice room. But if you're trying to play this in a competition to convince someone that this is a viable decision, we have to be able to play it consistently, right? So that's when we get to a point where if we're going to perform this, we have to make the decision, is this a musical tool or is this just a gimmick, right? So for me, the music always comes first. Am I interfering with the counterpoint if I shift it up an octave? Am I distorting any harmonic considerations if I'm pushing it up or down an octave? Those are the conversations to be had, rather than I want to be the macho person to show off how high I can squeak. And so I think when we can think about the music first and truly thinking about the altissimo register as an extension of the instrument's voice, that often guides my decision-making process for those 8VA, 8VB topics. I hope that answers the question, Kevin. Yeah, like the Iber. That's an infamous one. I personally don't do it because at least in the rest of the piece, the only time we see something coming out close to that high E is in the cadenza, right? So that's another case for which we might want to choose to save that super flashy part for the cadenza. But yeah, sure, yeah. But it's a good thing to practice, to hold yourself accountable to playing that register in tune, right? So that's another case where that's something that we can strive for in our practice, but in the performance, we have to make a sound decision based in logic rather than like our ego, I think. Great. Yeah. Awesome. So if there aren't any more questions, I'd be happy to wrap up. And if you want to reach out to me, oh, sorry, Nicholas, you had a question. Sorry, Nick, I can't quite hear you. I know you're unmuted, but on my end, I can't hear.
Did you know that you have to turn your microphone on in order to be heard?
Oh, that's gotten me so many times.
Surprisingly.
All right. So explaining 8VA to the John Sampins in the world, who are, the purest mentality of why would you like detract from the composer's intent. I do a lot of transcribing and arranging myself, so I have my own justification for this. But how what do you say to the people who are like, this is absolutely not the composer's intent?
Well, I would go back to the original manuscript and that that like even in her original conception of the piece, you open the manuscript of her sketches, and the first thing that you see is the alto in the manuscript. It's not saxophone, not alto saxophone, but alto meaning viola. Um, so I'm not trying to say that um, that the saxophone designation of the dedication or that we should that or that sorry I should backtrack. I shouldn't say that we shouldn't study the saxophone part because I think that's really important. But I also want to make sure that we acknowledge what I believe is her intent, and because she went to such a deep extent to make sure that the viola versions of the piece were preserved in the score, but also in another published part, that it would be sort of blind of us to not understand her conceptions of the piece, even though they're across instruments. And for me, because of her dedication to Mule, I think she might have adjusted a lot of the music because he didn't play any altissimo. So then I just wonder, because of her practice of republishing pieces as she saw commercial success, I imagine she would be someone that would also endorse this extension of the ranges for the saxophone. We will never know because we obviously can't ask her. And we don't know that if she actually composed the piece from beginning to end, right? To show that like the trajectory of fewer and fewer discrepancies throughout the piece. If the piece was originally conceived for viola and then adapted for saxophone, we won't know. But from my observation of the process, that's what I would see. So certainly study the original source, but then we have this discussion with the Schmidt and the Debussy too, and we see so many versions of the Debussy out there that are endorsed by so many people. And I think it's important to have these conversations in the field. And just again, there are so many ways to make these concepts more relevant. I hope that helps answer the question. I don't know if yeah, certainly. With some teachers that I've played this for, I've met a lot of resistance on like, well, why would you play the viola part? It says saxophone part on top, but certainly if we dive a little bit deeper in the conversation or what's provided, I think there are arguments for the viola part. Kevin asked, did Mule have any influence on that discussion? So I think in my understanding of the research, he did play the Furieuse, the third movement of the piece, but that obviously doesn't have any altissimo in it. But I'm in reading resources like this, the Rascher reader, for example. If we see the accounts of Mule and Rascher performing pieces like the Glasnost Concerto or Ibert, for example, they have very opposing ideas on how these pieces should be performed. Rascher uh, wouldn't he would say that if you left the altissimo out, it was sort of blasphemous, that wasn't a true performance of the work. And Mule would say that, well, he did say optional, so I'm taking the option not to. Um, so so in that case, I know that Mule and Rascher had differing opinions on how to approach this 8 VA matter, but certainly, or sorry, I'm not sure where he stood on this piece of the Decruck Sonata exactly, because even though the piece was dedicated to him, he never performed the whole thing. I mean, he had in some of Rousseau's biographical, in Rousseau's accounting of Mule's life, so many pieces were written and dedicated to him that there's no way that he could perform everything. So unfortunately, the Crook is one of the ones that he never got to.
Yeah, in the last listening session, I remember Dr. Nab shared a recording of Mule doing the altissimo in Ibert, like I think in the first movement. So I'd be curious, yeah, of course, if he ended up doing any of the altissimo in Decruck as well later on.
Yeah, we'll never know, but it's just interesting to see how these different giants in the saxophone history chose to approach these iconic works. And also, thanks for the comment, Eric. It's good to see you. Great. Well, if there are no more questions, and just checking the gallery and the chat one more time, but thank you so much to everyone here for sharing this afternoon with me. I know it's certainly a strange time to be a performing musician, but I'm very grateful for people like Dr. Nab who create these venues to, have us tune in from all over the world to talk about something that we care a lot about. And so thank you again for sharing this part of your afternoon with me. And I hope that we'll be able to reconvene in person soon. So until then, stay safe, keep practicing, and keep in touch. I guess follow me on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. All the good stuff, and I hope to see you all soon. So thank you so much for a great session.